Hey class, this is Steve again. Hope you guys are doing well. Hope you're enjoying the class so far this semester. Tonight we're going to look at Chapter 4, which has to do with the question of the arguments for the existence of God. The questions are, is there a God? And if so, what proof is there that a God exists? This is part of the philosophy of religion. It's part of most religions who believe in a supreme being. Um, there are, of course, some of the Eastern religions that don't believe in necessarily a supreme being, so this would not really apply. But for any of the other religions that have a singular monotheistic God that they worship, then this question comes about. And in this chapter, the author talks about 4 or 5 different approaches. And I'm just going to hit the highlights of these so that in case maybe you didn't understand it as well as you're going through some of this heavy reading, maybe this will help a little bit. The first one is the cosmological argument. Cosmological argument basically is very simple, and it means that there had to be a first mover or a first starter of everything that is. And that first starter or that first mover is God. So the idea is, think of it this way. One could argue, where do trees come from? And you could say, well, they come from seeds. Where do the seeds come from? You could say, well, they come from the trees. But eventually you have to get back to whichever came first. Let's say the tree did. Okay, how did the tree come about? Well, it came about through the ground. Well, how did the ground come about? How did the fertilizers come about? And then whatever your answer is to that, you keep going back and back and back. So the question is why or what? And eventually, if you go back far enough, the question is, how did everything get started? There had to be something that initiated the first movement. So cosmological argument says exactly that there's the proof of God because there had to be a first starter or a beginner to create something from nothing. Now, there's a slight twist on it where some believe that there was something that existed, and then this first something was started by the first mover. But that's a very small branch of that. What I want you to know from the cosmological argument is simply that the point is there had to be a first mover or first starter of everything that is, and therefore that first starter or first mover is God. So that's the cosmological argument. Let me see, I was going to go through some of my notes here. Let's go on to the teleological one because I think you'll find that one interesting too. Teleological argument basically says that everything is so complex, everything is so sophisticated that there could not help but be a God who created this. This is very similar to intelligent design. If you look at the human body and its complexities, this didn't just happen, but instead it was created. Simply because of the sheer complexity of the issue, that it had to be created. Look at the world and look at the physics that surround the world. The right gravity pull, the right blend of oxygen and nitrogen so that we can breathe, the right combinations of hydrogen and oxygen to make water. Too complex. The universe as a whole, the fact that the planets are spinning at certain rates and that they don't just tip over and fly into nowhere's land, but they actually rotate and stay afloat, if you will, in the middle of space. And then you consider the whole universe and its complexities. So the teleological, it comes from a couple Greek words, logos, which means word or study of, and then teleos, which means the end, if you will. So they're looking at it from an end standpoint, and the end standpoint says, look, everything's just way too complex. This could not happen by itself. This had to have been created. Okay, so that's the teleological argument. The next one, which I think is really, really interesting, is the ontological one. Now, ontological is a really unique argument. And as a matter of fact, the author says, the argument is considered to be one of the most intriguing ever devised. And that sounds like it might be a quiz question, as a matter of fact. Which argument says that it is considered to be the most intriguing ever devised? So it is the ontological argument. The basic premise of the ontological argument is that if you can think of a being greater than yourself, then therefore there must be a being greater than yourself. In other words, if your mind has the capacity to think of something far greater, far bigger, far more complex, supreme being, then the fact that we can think of it tells us that there is in reality such a being. If there were no being, then we could not think of such a large entity. Now, I know that sounds a little confusing, but think of it, try to think of it this way again. Let me try to repeat it. If you can think of this greater being, then the greater being must exist, because otherwise your mind could not think of that greater being. In other words, our minds are finite. So in order for us to think of something infinite, something or someone who is the supreme being, a God, or the God, then there must be one. Otherwise, we couldn't even comprehend such a thing. So that's basically the ontological argument. The sheer fact that we can think of a God or the supreme being tells us that in fact such a being exists. And that is a really interesting argument. If it's still confusing, I have some supplemental reading that I'd encourage you to read through. And I think that will help you a great deal. The next one, which I think is another really interesting one, is the pragmatic argument. The pragmatic argument. And that's a really interesting one because really what it says is it's a bet. It's a wager. For example, think of the Super Bowl, which is coming up. I know I just dated this video by saying that, but if you're watching this and it's past the Super Bowl, well, I'm sorry, but Super Bowl, this coming weekend, it's the New England Patriots, my favorite team, of course, has always been my favorite team, against the Atlanta Falcons. There are people all over this country, all over the world, making bets, making wagers. The pragmatic approach to proving that such a being exists is that you're wagering that there is a God. Because if there is a God and you wagered for that God, then you're in good shape. Because when you die, you'll spend eternity with God. That this one God, this powerful God, will help you in your life. Will be available to you, and then when you die, you'll spend eternity with him. If you lose the wager, if no God exists at all, but you've wagered that he does, then what you've missed out on is human pleasures, human things that you might have done if you had believed that there was no God to begin with. The converse is true as well. If you wager on the fact that there is no God, you're saying, okay, my money's on the fact there is no God, then if you win, that is, there is no God, then you've had a lifetime full of pleasures. But if you lose and there is a God, then you could spend eternity in a very bad situation. So pragmatic is exactly that. I'm wagering. On the one hand, if I bet there is a God, then, and if there really is, then I've got it made. If I wager that there is no God and I win, then I've had a lifetime full of pleasures, but there is no eternity, so I've lost out on nothing. So I hope that makes sense. Reread that section in your reading for this week. But again, it's just simply a wagering, laying the odds as to whether or not there's a God or not. And then finally, the last one, which I guess we can all kind of assume that this would come down to, if you're arguing by reason, which is what all four of these are that we've looked at so far, the cosmological, the teleological, the ontological, and the pragmatic, and if through your reasoning you say, okay, they're all flawed, and as you've read through this, you find out the strengths and the weaknesses of each of those arguments. So since there are flaws in the arguments, therefore they cannot be the true argument because there's flaws in it. There's things that are wrong in it. So therefore, I will believe in nothing. And this is where atheism comes into play. From the Greek word theos, which means God, and whenever you put an A in front of a word in Greek, it makes it the opposite. So atheism means not God or against God. So atheism says, look, none of the other arguments, none of the other four arguments make a lick of sense. They all have flaws in it, therefore they cannot be, by reason, something that I will follow. Because why would I follow something that isn't completely flawless? So therefore, I will believe in nothing. I will believe in the fact that there is no God. So, which by definition is in and of itself a belief. To say that I don't believe in God is to say my belief is I don't believe in God. So forget that part of it. The point being, I'm not going to adhere to any of these other reasons that say why there is a God. Instead, I'm going to say there is no God, and that's atheism. Real quickly again, cosmological says that there was a first mover, somebody who started everything, and by starting everything, that proves that there is a God, because as you go back, as you try to follow how things were created, and you keep going back and back and back, it finally comes to the point where, hey, there had to be somebody who started this, so therefore there's a God. The teleological argument basically says things are so complex, the universe, the world, human beings, thought, all these things are so complex that they could not have just randomly happened, that someone had to have created this complexity. And that someone has to be a supreme being, God. Ontological is the one that says, if I can think it, then there must be such a thing. Otherwise, I couldn't think it. I could not think of a waterfall if there were no waterfalls. I could not think of an automobile if there was no automobile. So how can I think of a God unless there's a God? So in a very, very base way, that's what the ontological says. The pragmatic approach says, hey, I'm going to bet, I'm going to wager. And depending on which side I wager, I could win or lose. And then finally, the last one is saying all four of those are flawed, and therefore, because they are flawed, I'm not going to believe in any of these proofs, so-called proofs by reason, that says God exists. Instead, I'm going to say that no God exists. So I hope that helped a little bit. As you read through this chapter, I've provided a number of supplemental materials too. Please read through those, because I think they'll help you a great deal in understanding these very important arguments for the proof of the existence of God. if you take any other philosophy course, religion course, whatever, you'll run into these arguments. So please make sure you understand these well. Okay? Thanks a lot, and it was good seeing you all, and talk to you soon.